The webinar is live.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our Rosenberg webinar, Public Gain and Private Profit, Earned Value in Social Enterprise. If we could now switch to the homepage for the webinar for our audience. Thank you. Social entrepreneurs are building new value propositions that use private investment to produce sustainable social change organizations while delivering direct cost reductions to government support for social services. By directly quantifying the economic value that is earned through positive social change, these social enterprises are bringing new life and much needed balance to a strategy for improving the human condition. Our keynote speaker provides the context on public and private financing for social entrepreneurs and organizations committed to social change. Our panel of experts contain a brief case study followed by perspectives born of their experiences in the public and private sector funding. These comments will be followed by an interactive panel discussion and Q&A with the audience. I'm Alan Lyles, your moderator for this virtual conference. It occurs as part of the Henry A. Rosenberg Dialogue that is made possible by the generous support of the Henry and Ruth Blaustein Rosenberg Foundation and the University of Baltimore. The aim of the Rosenberg Dialogue series is to explore opportunities for the private sector to work in partnership with the public and nonprofit NGO sectors to create a vibrant and economically strong society. A few organizational details before we begin. Our conference is being recorded, and afterwards a link to the recording will be sent to all who registered. The times for today are approximate and may be affected by technology or the types of questions that are asked. Please enter your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We'll have time for a few questions following each of our speakers, and then an open discussion Q&A period for all following Mr. Will Anderson's opening comments. If your question is not answered live, we'll do so after the event and share that with our attendees. First, today's discussants and their short bios. Our welcome will come from Dean Roger Hartley, the College of Public Affairs at the University of Baltimore. Our keynote, Dr. J. Howard Jem Kucher, is a pracademic, an associate professor of social innovation in the Graduate School of the University of Maryland, Baltimore, where he directs the groundbreaking Master of Science in Health and Social Innovation. An award-winning teacher and internationally recognized thought leader in social entrepreneurship, he cultivates strong entrepreneurial skill development for students, researchers, and professionals through experiential learning courses and workshops. He is the lead author of Social Entrepreneurship, a Practice-Based Approach to Social Innovation, recently published by Edward Elgar Publishers. Our speakers. First, we will have someone who speaks as a practitioner from the field who has deep experience. Ms. Amma Felix joined Collegiate Directions, Inc., CDI, in September 2017. She is president and CEO. She leads CDI's mission to close the educational opportunity gap for first-generation, low-income high school students by providing academic and wraparound support services to scholars to ensure that they achieve college graduation and smooth transition into careers, and providing consulting services to high schools to support their efforts to advise students on finding the best fit college option. Ms. Felix also raises funds to support and sustain CDI and refines the business model to increase its footprint and its impact. She has deep experience in the issues that we are discussing today. Previously, she worked at the United Negro College Fund from 2012 to 2017 and was vice president for strategy and secretary of the corporation for 3 years. Our second speaker and panelist is Mr. Darius Graham. Mr. Graham is a lawyer and leader in the areas of philanthropy, social impact, and innovation. At the Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Foundation, Darius leads the foundation's grant-making strategy in Baltimore and manages several signature initiatives and partnerships focused on economic mobility, civic leadership, and community development. Previously at Johns Hopkins, Darius served as the founding director of 2 university-wide innovation and entrepreneurship programs, Social Innovation Lab and Fast Forward U, Student Innovation Hub, where he helped students, faculty, and community members transform new technologies and novel ideas into viable ventures. Prior to that, Darius founded and led DC Social Innovation, a nonprofit that provided funding and pro bono assistance to help launch and grow innovative grassroots community initiatives in Washington, D.C. He is a civil society fellow with the Aspen Institute, a trustee of the Baltimore Museum of Art, and a trustee of the Baltimore Museum of Industry. His work and insights are highlighted in 2 books, Becoming a Changemaker, an actionable, inclusive guide to leading positive change at any level, and In the Business of Change, How Social Entrepreneurs Are Disrupting Business as Usual. Our third speaker and panelist is Mr. Will Anderson. He is an impact executive who builds bridges between people to produce mutual public-private benefits for all stakeholders. In 2020, Will co-founded Impact Principles, a strategic consultancy to drive bottom-line outcomes for business and community alike. In 2021, Will was selected into the Global Kernel Fellowship, merging business strategy, social impact enterprise, and blockchain technology, all of which will transform local economies and the nature of work in society. Importantly, for our purposes today, Will has led the Baltimore County Economic and Workforce Development Agency. He has taught at the Towson University College of Business and founded multiple tech startups. And now, I did that to let you know who will be speaking with you and not to interrupt the flow of our discussion with biographical information subsequently. There is more biographical information on our website. It is now my honor to introduce the Dean, College of Public Affairs at the University of Baltimore, Dr. Roger Hartley, to welcome you. Dean Hartley.
Thank you, Alan. I am really pleased to be with you all this afternoon on behalf of the entire University of Baltimore College of Public Affairs, but also the entire University of Baltimore. I'm really pleased to welcome our guests today, Amma, Jim, Darius, and Will. And to each of those of you who are in attendance today. And as a reminder, please pass along the link later. This is being recorded so that it can be used in classes and or in other settings as well, which I really appreciate. I want to begin with some thank yous that are really heartfelt and are needed for me to say. And I want to begin with thanks to you, Dr. Lyles, for the incredible leadership that you've provided to the Rosenberg series as our college's Rosenberg professor. If you don't know a lot about Dr. Lyles likes to introduce others and tell about their bios, but he doesn't talk a lot about himself. And I've enjoyed that about him as a colleague, but I like to say a few things about him when I get the chance. Dr. Lyles is a member of the National Academy of Public Administration as a fellow, which is one of the highest distinctions of leaders and academic leaders in the field of public administration. He's also the winner of our University System of Maryland's Regents Award for scholarship and activity, as well as holding the Rosenberg Chair that I mentioned before. Dr. Lyles, thank you for all of the incredible engaging work that you have done over the years for the college, but especially this series that's really important to us. Really appreciated. I'd like to also thank others behind the scenes, our staff, and particularly our OTS staff who are with us here today, who help us put on these webinars. And really during a time and after COVID, the opportunity to reach so many more people in a virtual environment as we are able to do here today. I really love this topic very much because it crosses the academic interests of the College of Public Affairs, which is Maryland's only college that's completely dedicated to public service. But it also crosses the boundaries into our Merrick School of Business, our School of Law, and our College of Arts and Sciences, which is really, really exciting. I love the topic very much. The College of Public Affairs, I'd be a bad dean if I didn't speak about it for a minute, but the College of Public Affairs trains leaders at the undergraduate level, but especially graduate and professional program level in the fields of public administration and international affairs, health and human services, and criminal justice. We have two amazing centers that have added to the value of our state and our region, the Schaefer Center for Public Policy, as well as our Center for Drug Policy and Prevention. Our work in policy and politics, and really, most importantly, training leaders in public service is something that I'm very proud of our team for doing. We're also leaders in social equity, having won the 2018 Social Equity Award from a national organization known as NASPA. I am excited again about our topic, but also our speakers today, and I'm going to learn a lot by staying around. But I wanted to just give a couple brief remarks on the topic. In public administration and policy circles, and when I taught before becoming a dean, we used to speak deeply about public research on the role of the public sector in improving people's lives. And that's viewed through a lot of different lenses. You know, one lens that we hear about often in policy debates and circles is our government efficient, and is it effectively delivering policies and practices to the public? But there are other lenses that are really critically important to government. And these also come out in social entrepreneurship, in the business sector, and also the nonprofit sector as well. For the business sector, of course, efficiency and effectiveness is really important in delivering a product. It's really important in delivering a product, but often through profit motives. Although this gets blurred too with the subject of our webinar today being focused on social entrepreneurship, where the motive for profit also has a public value or an improvement of lives value that is deeply part of it and attached to it. The public sector has additional expectations, though, that can bring tension to this efficiency and effectiveness quandary, and a real tension, and that is responsiveness. We expect our public sector to be responsive to constituents and citizen and non-citizen needs. We expect responsiveness to the underserved. We respect democratic principles. And all of these, by definition, sometimes are not efficient and not necessarily always effective either. And we try to go that direction in the public sector, but that tension gets dragged away as soon as we need to provide mail to a part of a world or a country that has very few people in it, but is deserving of mail, for instance. Along with responsiveness, however, there's a new public administration that notes that public service must have a commitment also to social equity. And the ability to lead public service in that direction is a critical piece of efficiency, effectiveness, and responsiveness, but is in of itself a separate goal. And so why do I bring all of those things up? Well, in public policy, we know that public policy is delivered by lots of different sectors at the same time. It's not only government, it's nonprofits, it's that provide the opportunity to fill gaps where gaps exist. And in the private sector, delivers public services through contract, right? And then we come to social entrepreneurs, which kind of turn all of this in a way into a muddier place, but a really wonderful muddy place where we see responsiveness, effectiveness, the ability to provide social equity, and also the ability to be responsive to people. All of that rolled into several different places with several different pulls. And the final thing that I wanted to mention that's going to be interesting about that the subject today, I think, and what I'm really excited to learn from our speakers about too, is the role of ethics. our public sector, nonprofit sector, private sector, social entrepreneurship sector, all of those combined into one, especially public sector leaders, are governed by ethics, all. And in the midst of trying to provide services from so many different places, access becomes so critically important. And with that, ethical boundaries have to be placed and have to be adhered to. And with access comes opportunities for the powerful to do great things, but sometimes perhaps not so great things. And so I think in the world of a business sector that contracts with government, a nonprofit sector that fills gaps, and a social entrepreneurship sector that provides services as well in a different way, but has been doing so for a very long time, where ethics come into play and where access comes into play matters more and more and more. I want to say again to everyone, thank you for coming. I also want to say thank you in advance to each one of our guests today. We are so thrilled to have you. And on behalf of the entire College of Public Affairs, I'm really excited myself to be here to learn. And I want to thank each and every one of you for being part of the Rosenberg Dialogues. Thank you, Alan, and thanks to all.
Thank you, Roger. We appreciate your comments and the provocative points that you raised. We'll work to introduce, as they are relevant to the topics, weave those together. With that in mind, I would like to turn to our keynote, Dr. Jim Kutcher, who is someone I have great respect for and know his work in almost molecular detail, as he was, disclosure of conflict of interest, a doctoral student of mine. I was his advisor. Dr. Kutcher, it's yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Lyles. Thank you, Dean Hartley. Dean Hartley, in your comments, I do want to reflect on two things very quickly. One is your use of the word muddy. I use the word messy, but it's the same context in that when you try to bring about profit and purpose and community engagement all in the same single effort, it gets very, very complex and often contradictory. And then the other thing was your comment about boundary spanning. I am a University of Baltimore boundary spanning example in multiple ways. My MBA is from the Merrick School. My DPA is from your organization. And there was a point in time in my career and life where I was a student, a faculty member, and a staff member at the University of Baltimore all at the same time, which I think is part of how this happened. I'm not really sure, but I think that may be part of how that happened. So anyway, thanks for the opportunity. Thanks for your kind words. Dr. Lyles, thank you for having us here. Let me put up a little slide deck. So earned income and earned value is what I'm going to talk about. And I have the pleasure of talking about this as a concept. And my colleagues have the challenge and joy of tearing that concept apart in all of the ways that it may not actually work in real life. I have had experience making this happen in real life, so I'm not speaking totally from the abstract, but we are going to walk through some concepts here. And so I'm going to get my slides to advance. My apologies. For some reason, my screening is paused there. There we go. All right, so we're going to talk about social innovation and social entrepreneurship a little bit. We're going to talk a little bit about concepts of value. I have a couple of examples of some social enterprises just to kind of prime the pump. And then we're going to get deep into this value capture notion with illustrations. And I warn you ahead of time, the illustrations do include arithmetic. So those of you that want to follow along with that, you feel free to have your pencils handy and check my math. So this concept of social entrepreneurship isn't really anything that's that new, but it's become quite popular in the last 25, 30 years for a lot of reasons. One of which is that we have any number of intractable social problems. And if you live in or around Baltimore, you can list all those very quickly. Costs for delivering social services continue to rise. The traditional nonprofit sector has been experiencing decreasing revenue for quite some time, and COVID certainly didn't help any in that regard. in terms of getting the donations and grants and gifts that nonprofits depend on to fund their operations. And then, quite frankly, there's just a lot of old paradigms that exist that really need to be re-examined a little bit. So just because, again, I did my doctoral work under Dr. Lyles and I do teach for a living, I have to provide a definition or two. This is from a great work by Phils and Miller. The underlines and emphasis are mine, but a social innovation is a novel solution that's more effective, efficient, sustainable, or just, and for which the value accrues primarily to society as a whole. Now, you notice it says primarily. It does not say exclusively. It says primarily, and that's a key point that we're going to dive into throughout the afternoon. It can be a product, a process, a technology, but can also be an idea, or a piece of legislation, or a social movement. So that's a kind of broad description of social innovation. There's a lot of different names for these organizations. Social enterprise is typically what you see as the primary name. And there's an organization all over the US. There happens to be a Baltimore chapter spinning up as well of the Social Enterprise Alliance. And they define a social enterprise as an organization that addresses a basic unmet need through a market-driven approach. And I think the thing that's important about this definition is they go on to say that a social enterprise can be a for-profit, a nonprofit, a cooperative, a benefit corporation. It can take any number of legal forms. And I think one of the things that has constricted thinking for a lot of years is that we understand nonprofit as an industry and as an operating model, and it's really only a tax status. It's not a way to actually run an organization. It's just how you file your taxes. So I think the interesting thing about Social Enterprise Alliance's definition is it spans that boundary and says, look, you can be organized a lot of different ways. We're not as concerned about how you're structured. We're concerned about what you're trying to do. So a couple of quick product and service examples just to kind of get your head around this notion of a social enterprise. This is an organization here in Baltimore called Local Color Flowers. Now, I will say up front that I am a husband. And as a husband, flowers are a necessary part of my survival strategy. And when you go to Local Color Flowers and you meet Ellen Frost, the owner, Ellen provides incredibly beautiful floral arrangements that are unlike anything you have ever seen before. They are completely unique. They are very beautiful and they're priced competitively. So she's not, charging extra for the additional level of artistry that she provides. And if you comment on how unique they are, Ellen will simply thank you and take your money. If you ask Ellen how she produces these incredibly unique arrangements, she'll very casually mention that all her flowers are grown within 100 miles of the store. And again, if you don't push any further, she'll simply thank you and take your money. But if you engage in a conversation with Ellen, you'll find out that the typical floral arrangement at the typical florist contains products that are often grown overseas. So what that means is that the roses that you had delivered to your sweetheart were grown overseas, put on a truck, driven to an airport, put on a plane, flown to another airport, put on another truck, driven to a wholesaler, put on another truck, driven to a retailer, who then makes the arrangement, puts them in a van and takes them to your sweetheart. It's a lot of tailpipes. If you're grown within 100 miles of the store, all of a sudden your carbon footprint is dramatically smaller. Grown within 100 miles of the store. And if you engage Ellen further, you find out that in order to make that supply chain work with all those tailpipes, the people cutting the flowers overseas are not even making a subsistence wage. So because the flowers are grown within 100 miles of the store, Ellen is able to pay her growers a subsistence wage. But again, if you never ask any of those questions, all you see is an incredibly unique floral arrangement at a competitive price delivered for some very nice people. This is John Heron. John Heron ran an organization called Harbor City Services for about 25 years. John has an MBA as well as a master's in social work. He is a licensed clinical social worker. Harbor City Services, as you can see from the truck, is a document storage and moving company. Very simple business. Pick up the box, put it on the truck, take the box off the truck, put it in the warehouse or put it wherever it's going. But John did something very, very different. John staffed his company with people who are suffering from schizophrenia. Now, if you know anything about that particular disease, you know that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when the disease takes over your life. And what John did, instead of the typical commercial business that would say, okay, you've had a relapse, you're out of a job. John would say, okay, you've had a relapse, go see your social worker, and when you're ready, come back and your job is still here. So what he had to do to make that happen was he had to overstaff, which obviously meant it impacted his profit margin. John ran this business as a fully commercial enterprise, never took a dime. He was actually embarrassed the first day he had to take a grant. He ran it for a number of years. It's now been merged with Humanum, which is a large social services agency in Baltimore. But that's just a couple of quick examples of sort of what the basics of social enterprise does. You're using a business to produce a social benefit. The other thing that's interesting about Harbor City Services is he found out over time that the physical nature of moving and storage was actually therapeutic. And the folks that worked for him actually had fewer episodes over time than the average population. So he also had a long-term social benefit that he didn't even plan. That just kind of happened as the business grew. So now I want to talk about value capture, which is really the heart of what we're going to spend our time on this afternoon. So this is a diagram from a couple of friends of mine, Tom Lumpkin and Sophie Back. It was a paper that received rave reviews for a number of years. And it sort of talks about the intersections within society and the places where value has been created. So at the top of the screen, you have community, which is very simply individuals living their lives. And the lower, my right side, you have ecosystem. And that's all of the support structures. That's government, that's institutions like the University of Baltimore, that is organized foundations, all that sort of stuff that provides structure for the world. And then, of course, you have enterprise, which is the business world. And as you can see, the way they diagrammed this is that when the community and the ecosystem interact, you get social wealth, you get an improved society. When community and enterprise interact, you get communal wealth, you get employment, you get all those kinds of good things. And when enterprise and ecosystem interact, you get economic wealth, businesses get stronger, people make money, stock offerings are issued, all that great commercial stuff. And their concept and their construct is that there's a place where all three of those can interact and produce what they've labeled civic wealth. And that's sort of the focus of where we look at this concept of economic value. So in a traditional public-private partnership, you have mostly interaction between enterprise and ecosystem. When you get into the notion of social innovation with value capture, you also bring in the community in a very different way that adds to the value and provides some structure. These last two slides are my interpretation, by the way. Tom and Sophie have seen them. They're happy with them, but it's not their work. So I do want to be clear, particularly since my dissertation chair is on the call. So if you're familiar at all with social change, there's this thing called a logic model. And a logic model is simply how an organization thinks about bringing about social change. This is a very simplified logic model for a workforce development agency. We can all think of a workforce development nonprofit, probably one in our neighborhood or in our town. They all work pretty much the same. You take an individual who is either recovering from an addiction or returning from incarceration. You give them some sort of a skill. You teach them how to be a carpenter. You teach them how to be a sous chef. You teach them how to be an electrician. When that skill has been learned, you then place that individual with an employer. And typically, at the end of that, you have a party because Jim is now clean and sober and has a steady job. And then you just repeat the whole process and you fund all that with grants and gifts. Now, the next couple of slides look very similar, but I want you to pay attention to the yellow highlighting as we walk through them. So here we have in the first highlighted yellow box, the typical nonprofit workforce development organization. That organization is funded by grants and gifts, individual charitable donations, and structured grants. They do not charge a fee to the client. They do not charge a fee to the employer. They may ask the employer for a donation from time to time, but they do not charge a fee. However, in the middle highlighted yellow box, you also have for-profit employment agencies that do charge a fee, sometimes on both sides of the transaction. They always charge a fee to the employer. They sometimes even charge a fee to the client. And they're typically funded by investors or banks because they're producing return on equity and return on income that can be banked. Our world of social enterprise, you take a hybrid model and you say, no, we're not going to charge a fee to the client because that's who we're trying to help. But we're going to charge a fee to the employer. We're going to turn that nonprofit world on its head and say, no, we're producing someone of value. And we're going to get a fee from the employer. And in this model, you use grants to fund the growth. But then as you grow the organization, you produce income, and that's how you pay operations. Now, when I present this slide, a lot of times individuals say, well, wait a minute, I don't know if that's kosher. First of all, it is. There's nothing in a nonprofit legal structure that says you can't earn income. You just can't distribute it to shareholders. Secondly, there is a $167 billion industry in staffing and recruiting in the United States. And this is actually numbers a few years old, so it's significantly bigger than that, I'm sure. I spent an hour or so one afternoon going through the GuideStar database. And all I searched for was organizations with the phrase workforce development as part of their name. I found 21,000 nonprofits in the United States with that phrase in their name. That does not mean there's only 21,000 nonprofits doing that work. That just means there's 21,000 that has it in their name. There's probably at least double that or more that are actually doing the work. If those organizations started charging fees for the placement of those employees, which, by the way, statistics have proven are more loyal and more dependable than the employees that they get through the traditional staffing service. If those nonprofits doing that work, those 21,000 organizations, were able to capture 5% of the staffing and recruiting market, they would bring in an additional $8.3 billion in revenue without having to change a thing other than asking to be paid for the value that they create in what they already do. And that, my friends, is the core of this value capture. And I believe to the depths of my soul that nonprofit social benefit organizations, whatever you want to call them, produce more value, direct economic value, than any other sector of the economy. The only problem is we're not training folks in how to quantify that, and we're not teaching them how to capture it and go out and get paid for it. All right, this is the part where the arithmetic comes in. So this is a hypothetical organization. And you can see in the yellow box, we have here the cost of incarceration per person per year. That's the PPPY. In the state of Maryland, it costs us $37,200 a year to keep somebody in jail, which is a little bit absurd on its face, but we'll leave that for another day. The recidivism rate in the state of Maryland is 41%. Almost half of the people that are returning from incarceration are eventually going to go back. What that means economically is that every time someone returns from incarceration, we have effectively incurred a future cost to society of $15,000 per person per year. We don't know when that bill is going to come due, but we know it's going to come due, and that is taxpayer money. Now, let's say we have someone who's been trained from one of the great universities in the Maryland system on how to produce an effective social intervention. We're now in the blue box. That social intervention reduces the recidivism rate within the population that they serve by half. They cut it from 41 to 21. It now reduces that future cost by half. So instead of $15,000, it's now $7,600 in future cost. If you have a 200-person capacity for that service, you have saved state government, the people of the state of Maryland, $1.5 million. Typical nonprofit, if it's serving well and it's doing its work and it knows its numbers, they can produce these kinds of numbers. And they can show what they're saving. they often use those savings as justification for another grant application. This is where the entrepreneur side of the world comes into play. So we still have the same program doing the same good work. But instead of getting grants, you go to private investment, not public money, private investment money. We're now in the orange box, and you arrange an impact investing transaction. And because you're a good entrepreneur and you've been well schooled, you figure out that it's going to cost $250,000 to stand this organization up. That's what the startup expenses is. And it's going to cost you $500,000 every year to run it. Payroll, rent, all those kinds of things. You ask the investor to provide an upfront investment of $2.75 million. That's 5 years of operating expenses plus your startup costs. You then take that investor with you to the government, the governor, the mayor, whoever is carrying those costs of incarceration. And you say, look, we can save you $1.5 million a year. And we know that because this program is effective. And here's all the statistics we've got to prove the program is effective. But you're not going to get the entire $1.5 million back. You're going to get some of it back because we recognize that if you don't have some tax savings, you're not going to have anything to run for reelection on. So we're going to give you a third of it. We're going to give you just over $500,000. The investor, because they put the money up, has a right to expect that money to come back. So they're going to get a third of it. And you running the program are also going to get a third of it, which also means that your operating expenses are continually funded so that $2 million that you have as the investment you can keep and save for a rainy day. And in 5.5 years, the investor is repaid. Maybe they stick around for another year to get some interest on their investment. But even in venture capital world, 5 to 7 years to recoup your investment is a normal timeline. So these are not timelines that are absurdly long in that regard. Now, again, this is an illustration, but just in case you think, I'm sorry, here's the formulas. Show my work. Thank you, Dr. Lyles. Here's some resources. I mentioned the Social Enterprise Alliance. There's an organization called the Global Impacting Investment Network and the Social Impact Bond Database, which is the one that I want to talk about for a minute. Because in case you think I'm making this all up, there are currently 26 of these deals in the US with a total of just over 200 million in capital and 650,000 lives that have been impacted. So this is real. Now, I have to say the US is not the leader in this. The UK is actually doing about twice, maybe 3 times that level of transaction. And some other European countries are also further ahead of us. But this is real life. This is not just a hypothetical illustration developed by some professor. This is the real world. This is actually happening. And my theory and my hypothesis and my point is to say, what we need to do is teach more people how to do this and how to capture that value. So with that, I will stop sharing, and I thank you for listening, and I look forward to batting this around for a while.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kuchar. We have a moment or two at this time, just before we pivot to our next speaker, Ms. Ama Felix. Are there any, if there are questions, if you'll put them in the Q&A, it could be that you'll want to hold them toward the end. That would be fine. And then we'll have also a time period in which there's active discussion and interaction among panelists and our keynote and the audience. At the moment, I am not seeing any questions listed. So let us turn now to Ms. Ama Felix for her discussion of CDI and these general ideas. Ms. Felix?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to talk to you a little bit about the work I do, which is an example of social enterprise. Collegiate Directions, Inc. is a nonprofit that was founded in 2005, and we work with young people once they're in high school, and we help them access and complete college. We also work with high school counselors and leadership teams to help them ensure that they're able to create a college-going environment within their schools, within their policies, practices, and procedures, and the like. So why is this work important? I would say a couple of things. One, and the audience that we work with are first generation to college students at the end of their sophomore year in high school who come from low income backgrounds. And as a result, they don't have the supports that are required to actually access higher education. So we work with them from the end of their sophomore year in high school, 2 years, junior and senior year in high school, and then 4 years of college. So we stay with each of our scholars for 6 years. It's a 6-year commitment. And why is this work important, and why did we start doing it? Research shows that more than half of talented students in this population don't ever apply to college at all, that could have otherwise gone to highly selective schools or colleges in general. They just don't apply. We found because they just don't think they can afford it. And they don't think they can get in, and they don't know the steps and the processes that are required. Also, they don't in the high schools, right? K through 12, as many of us know, many are severely under-resourced, and they don't have the supports within their high schools that are required to help them navigate what it takes to access in college. Research also shows that on average, high school counselors spend 2 hours per student over the course of 4 years advising them on college advising. So that's just another example of the tools and supports that are required for them are not present in many of their environments. We also know that in the state of Maryland, the amount of scholars to, I have a number here, number of students per counselor is almost 300 to 1. So back to the 2 hours over a course of 4 years of college advising goes to show you that there are insufficient resources for students to get access to these types of supports. So we've been doing this for 17 plus years. And so why is this relevant now? And I wanted to share 2 quotes to really kind of bring this up to speed. So I don't know if you've read, but over the last, I would say, couple of months, there have been data released that basically shows from NAEP and from ACT that basically the recent studies post-COVID of assessments in these areas, K through 12, different assessments over those years, as well as those who are poised to go to college through ACT, show that results from students are at a 30-year low. So that goes to show you that there are some gaps in learning. And this is going to persist, particularly for those in K-12, are going to persist over the next several years. So that goes to show you that even more supports are going to be needed going forward for why students need help getting into college. And I have here 2 quotes I wanted to share. One is from the CEO of ACT, in an article that was in the Wall Street Journal last month that basically says the COVID-19 pandemic's disruptions exacerbated the long-term systemic issues in education, hurting test scores. The magnitude of the declines this year in particular are alarming, as we see the growing numbers of seniors leaving high school without meeting the college readiness benchmarks in any of the subjects that ACT measures. That is just profound. And right, these impacts are going to ripple into the world of work and our future workforce. So that's significant. So the work that we do, we work, as I mentioned, in high school, and we provide supports. We also engage their families. We're not just dealing with individuals, but we're dealing with whole people. And so we work with their families, whatever their family constellation looks like. We collect their tax forms, which is a very sort of private, in particular, requiring of trust of us and us working with their families. And we help them access financial aid. We do not give scholarships ourselves. So that means we have to basically know, right, federal financial aid, the private sector supports, the state aid that's required, for the students who have a certain income. We work in Montgomery County. We work with schools where less than 50% of the students meet college readiness benchmarks. So we really believe that we're targeting the right population. Our scholars have to have a minimum of a 2.6 GPA to enter the program. So, we're really touching, and basically our scholars are about a third of the income of the area median income. So we're really touching the audience that our mission requires. What I would also say on the public sector side is that in the state of Maryland, I mentioned to you that basically many of the students that we serve would be undermatched because they're not applying to schools that they could otherwise get in. But also because they're not applying and because they don't know the process or don't even attempt it or try to attempt and fail. The financial aid that's dedicated to students who have these incomes are left unclaimed every single year. So last year in the state of Maryland, $58.3 million in unclaimed federal financial aid support was left on the table. So, part of our work is to help mine that type of opportunity and support. And so, you really need to be trained and skilled. And so we have a full-time team that really works with our scholars one-on-one over these years to provide the supports. So that's a snapshot, I'll keep it brief, on what we do, who we are, why our work is important. I will close with another quote. Recently, McKinsey did a study, and again, why is this work relevant going forward? McKinsey released a study called Racial and Ethnic Equity in U.S. Higher Education. Why I'm personally involved in this work is because I think higher education is a lever for economic opportunity. And I think it's really important. And so this quote here is, again, profound, and why I think this is important. Most of the scholars that we work with come from Black, Latino, Asian backgrounds. And as I mentioned, also are low income. So those are the populations we serve. The piece from McKinsey report, the recent McKinsey report that I wanted to share, is that higher education, like the United States, has challenges when it comes to its history. In fact, at the current rate, it would take colleges another 70 years to recruit enough Asian, Black, Latino, Native American students for their enrollment to somewhat reflect America's demographics. 70 years. And that figure would be dominated predominantly by Latino students. For Native American and Black students, it would take another 300 years to form a representative student body. So the point being is there's so much more work to do, and this work is super important. And that's why organizations like us exist, and we partner with local school districts, we partner with, private sector as regarding philanthropy to be able to deliver these services to students and families that are most vulnerable and most in need.
Thank you, Ms. Felix. That puts a very granular set of insights into what one particular aspect of social change that you are endeavoring to lead and to make sustainable. It adds to the types and the varieties that our keynote mentioned in his presentation. What drives throughout, it seems to me, is that I believe Jim said something to the effect of that it's not about profit, but you need to make some surplus, or words to that effect. These things are not about money per se, but money is the oxygen that causes them to be able to come into existence and to be sustained. One of the points I would like to make as a footnote to what you had discussed is the interconnections between so many needs in social change and being effective in basic roles in society. As a member of society, as a citizen, as a voter, as a member of a family, as a parent, all of these things require numeracy. And what you were discussing I was reading that because of AI, 50,000 additional engineers are going to be needed regularly. And if that is so, in order to tap into the real talent and the natural resources we have here, will require that organizations like yours and others be successful, expand, and proliferate. In addition, mathematics starts to be, if I recall correctly, starts to be more a sorting mechanism than an empowering mechanism by the 7th or 8th grade. And part of that is connected to whether someone can read by 3rd or 4th grade. And if they're behind grade in reading, when it comes time for the math, they can't read it enough to understand that. So it's taking each piece and trying to say, how do we come up with synergies around this? And with having said that, what I would like to do next is go to, excuse me, Mr. Graham and ask him for his insights from the perspective of a well-respected and large philanthropic organization who I am certain receives more requests, more proposals than can be funded. How do you calibrate those? And in the context that we're talking about today, what would you say are the important points that we should understand from the perspective of the foundation, Mr. Graham?
Yes, thank you all. It's so good to be here and to hear the discussion and to be a part of it. So I'm Darius. I'm with the Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Foundation, as was described earlier. We're a foundation that provides grants primarily to 501c3 nonprofits in many communities. I focus on our work here in the Baltimore region. We fund across a couple of issue areas: housing, health, jobs, and education. There's more specific funding priorities under each of those categories, but those are our broad themes. And we really focus on organizations, nonprofits that are providing direct services to older adult programs, after school programs for young people, those organizations who are accessing some kind of program to change the trajectory of their life. We do, in fact, receive many requests more. And so we do take a robust look at the requests that we receive across a number of dimensions. I believe first, we primarily look at the alignment with our funding priorities. So we have from our, sorry, can you all hear me all right?
You seem to intermittently be caught on a freeze and then it's released.
All right. I'll just get through my points here and then we can get to questions. So we look at a match with our funding priorities to make sure there is alignment with the types of things that our leadership works for us to fund. We do look at data, impact, and metrics. So we want to know that the programs that are applying to us have demonstrated some type of impact and shown that they can help move people to reaching the goals that the program seeks to achieve. We also look for deep connections to the community that's being served. So we want to know that you're not just coming into a community, launching something or running something in a neighborhood where you don't really have connections. But we want to know, how are you deeply connected to that community? How are you taking people who are parts of that community or people you're serving and lifting them up into leadership positions in your own organization? So we really look for those deep community connections. We also look for what we call leveraging funding. So we want to see, that you're not only coming to us to fund your budget, because we would not fully fund an organization or a program. We also want to see that you're going to different types of sources. So do you have other foundations? Do you have individual donors? Do you have companies that are giving you funds? Do you have earned revenue? What Jim was talking about. And really, do you have this diverse set of funding that we can just be a part of and support you in that way? So today's conversation really sort of gave me an idea of just a couple of examples that I'll highlight that our foundation has been involved with supporting. And the first two, or the first three, really are in the frame of nonprofits that are really making the case for how they're doing work that saves public dollars. So I'm thinking about groups like B360, based in Baltimore, that takes young people engaged in dirt bike culture and teaches them the STEM and the physics and other things related to the bikes. And part of what their case is that they will help save city and state government many dollars over the course of time by actually working with these young people and putting them, on an education and career path of working with dirt bikes versus an approach that focuses on criminalization. There's a program called Advanced Peace out in California that's about reducing gun violence. So they use a model where they have violence interrupters. They have folks who are, connected to those communities who go out and can interrupt some of these incidents. And they, do a really great job of not only doing that work, but articulating the dollar amounts that they're saving the public. So they estimate that generally a shooting with an injury may cost about $1 million to society, just in all the costs. So in the healthcare costs, ongoing social costs, collateral costs to families and the neighborhoods. And then the homicide may be north of about $2.5 million. So in 2019, this program in one city in California worked to prevent about 31 shootings. And they estimate that that saved the public between $30 million and $77 million. And it's important to note that this is an organization who has an annual budget at the time of about $2.4 million. So they're saying that with their $2.4 million budget, of which foundations like ours contribute to, they're able to save in one community about $30 million to $77 million, which is quite remarkable. And that dollar amount is important, but just think about those lives as well, which is even more important than the dollars. The next one I want to talk about is a program that's local, and this is the Hearing Health Collaborative. We really love when groups work together and can collaborate and not just do their work in their own silo. So we were very eager to support a collaboration of the Hearing and Speech Agency, Access Hears, and the Baltimore City Health Department. One of the things that I learned a couple of years ago is that hearing loss is really quite natural as we age, and that it is one of the health conditions that really goes unmet, especially if you are low income or no income older adult. And if you have untreated hearing loss, you're more likely to have higher healthcare costs in the future. They're probably going to face social isolation. You have a higher potential chance of dementia. And so if we can intervene and get you that hearing care when it matters, we can, prevent so many other negative consequences. So we were able to provide a $300,000 grant to this collaborative, the Hearing Health Collaborative, which again included 2 nonprofits and the Baltimore City Health Department. And they were able to provide care to about 94 people and estimate that they saved about $2 million in future health costs for those individuals. And then finally, I just want to close out by sharing 3 examples on the other side. So these are not nonprofits, but these are actually for-profit companies. And since they are for-profit, our foundation does not, provide them grants, of course, but they are startups that are working on issues of public importance and really making an impact. So they're really doing more to receive those private investments to make their work happen. One of them is called Upfront. They were part of the Techstars Equitech Accelerator in Baltimore. And they're actually recently announced a partnership with the Maryland Family Network. So they provide a tech platform that helps families search and find up-to-date information on childcare. So Maryland Family Network, is the right place for that. Upfront has the software capability. So they're forming this great partnership between a startup company, Upfront, Maryland Family Network, a nonprofit, to help families better access childcare opportunities. There's also an organization called EQL, or Equal Finance, which provides low interest or no interest loans to people facing a hardship. And they are, again, organized as a for-profit, but they're partnering with a lot of nonprofits and other social service organizations to help people who, find themselves in a hard spot, have an emergency bill, can't meet it, and get some support financially to help meet those needs. So again, we typically support the nonprofits and love when we can do so and leverage public funding, save dollars to the public. But then there are also some that are for-profit that we don't particularly work with, but are equally doing important work to receive private dollars, more from the investment side, and to achieve great outcomes for the community. So I will end there, but look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Darius. As I was listening to you, I had so many questions myself, but now is not the point for it. I'll be back to you. Thank you so much. And now We have seen the context from Dr. Kuchar. We've seen an instance and some of the broader discussions about the roles played by organizations such as what we're talking about. We've seen additional tangible examples from the philanthropist side and some of the salient lessons learned or key factors to consider when submitting a proposal or when viewing the work of the foundations. And now we'll take a look from Will Anderson's perspective, which was in government and now as related to government, but as a startup executive. Will?
Hey, thank you, Alan. Thanks, Roger and Jim and Amma and Darius too for pulling me into this work. You know, I wanted to build on what Amma was saying there for a second and inject a little optimism into her day. Jim and I were talking at the Social Enterprise Conference that Jim was running over at UMB earlier this year. All of the social entrepreneurs like Amma just exhausted, just physically exhausted from carrying this work and their families and COVID and keep going, you know, constant bailing of water, right? And UB, University of Maryland, has been carrying the water of social entrepreneurship as institutions by themselves in higher ed for a long time. And folks like Amma have been doing this work for, I forget what that was, 17 years. It was a long time to be doing this work. Weinberg's been in there funding. But here's a note of optimism. You cited the McKinsey study. PricewaterhouseCoopers does a study, I think it's every year, about environmental social governance issues. You know, what does society care about us doing this work? And their study last year showed that 86% of people, so this is consumers, customers, employees, investors, want their company to do way more than just the minimum of compliance in ESG, right? And they vote with their wallets and their feet where they're going to work, where they're going to spend their money. And that is largely millennials and Gen Z, right? That's huge populations of people. And so businesses will follow. So like this work that some of you have been carrying by yourself without money, without people for a long time, is about to have a lot of company on the large company side. Think big things like Patagonia giving their company away, a $3 billion company away to IKEA, really moving everything to recycled products, big things like that, but all the way down to small. So I think the things I wanted to talk about are I'll talk about the public side, my experience on the inside the government, and then the startup side, some of those social startups that I'm involved in. The first thing, Jim, when you mentioned market driven at the beginning, I'm thinking in my days of running a large economic development and workforce development agency in Baltimore County, which is really big, you know, $19 million program on workforce, you have to deal with reality, and that's the market, right? I mean, we were always trying to move people into market reality. So one of the things that Acumen talks about is using the market as a listening device about where we can do social good. You know, the market is not, unchecked markets are no good for anyone. But understanding the playing field that we're about to place people in and the power, and that markets, along with education and healthcare, have lifted 1 billion people out of poverty over the past 30 years. So there is power in that. And we need folks like Darius and Able Foundation and other foundations to fill in this patient capital that we don't have on the public side. But the two big themes that I think I took away out of my 8 years in running that organization were about risk and timing. Jim, you and I talked about this. I came to learn pretty quickly that the public has no risk tolerance of their government, right? It's my money, it's my government, I paid my taxes. Don't try anything risky. Don't listen and at all. Sorry, somebody's giving me a text here. Okay, I'm going to not read the chat. Sorry about that while I'm making my remarks. I'll catch up later. there is very little tolerance for the government to try things or even invest in risky things. They just get hammered. Elected officials are out if they've had a failure. That is a reality. So you have to deal with the risk. We need people to do riskier things to make change, and yet your government is not set up that way. It's not a bad thing. It's just that's the way it is. The second thing is timing. Like, solutions take so long, and election cycles are way faster. Jim mentioned you got to give back a little bit so that somebody who's taken a chance can actually campaign on something that's changed. Those are the realities. Elected officials are trying to solve generational problems in tight cycles. Like, you know, we have a very suspect transportation system in our region that keeps families from prospering with education, with work. That takes a generation to fix, and yet the people that are trying to fix it have tighter cycles. So risk is an issue, timing is an issue, and I think the money that Weinberg and other people bring to this is critical to kind of fill those gaps. One of the big success stories we had in Baltimore County and in Baltimore City and Maryland was at Trade Point Atlantic, so at the old Beth Steel. So this is a story of, I think, investment in different angles that can break through risk and timing. You know, we needed the community over on the eastern side of Baltimore County understood how bad things were when the steel plant closed, right? We had 30,000 people, then we had 2,000 people working, then we had nobody working, we had bankruptcy. It was easy for them to take a risk, to do something. And we in the county, we put in a lot of money in roads and stormwater infrastructure, and then private money came in to see that there was room for profit for them, a lot of room for profit for them. But they have over 5,000 people working down there. Now they just announced another 1,000 people coming at the port. So there's room for public benefit and private benefit, but the story needs to be understood by the public so that they can get behind these risky long-term investments. That was Trade Point Atlantic. I worked on it for 6 years and I absolutely loved it on the economic development side. On the workforce development side, Jim and I talked about this. It's difficult to do experiments in the social space. There are some random control trial experiments in workforce. I ran one during the Obama administration called the Workforce Innovation Fund. And we did this program called ACE in our area and around the country. And basically what it was taking was the hardest to employ, lowest skills, and trying to get them into family supporting jobs. And we had a lot of money, federal money to do it and room to fail, but we had to give services to 1,200 people and sort of give a placebo, deny services to 1,200 people to see if it worked. That is unbelievably hard to ask your staff to not help somebody in the same way they're helping the next person. But Jim showed a chart there on that logic model about workforce, you know, help stick somebody in a job. What we found there was that if you put a team of people, a wraparound team of people with these folks you were trying to help in a job and stuck with them 2 years after they got that job, we had 82% success rate with the hardest to serve people. It can be done. It was incredible that it worked. It was kind of that wraparound model that Thread uses in our city to kind of stay the long haul, go fight through the timing issue of helping people. But we didn't get funded again when the next administration didn't really value that model. So that was the election cycle. We had worked something out that seemed to work risk-wise, but there wasn't an appetite for it. But the other side of that, before I jump over to the startups, is during, I guess it was 2015, some European CEOs came over to try to embed their apprenticeship model here. With, again, this was Obama, so Vice President Biden was leading this initiative at the White House. A number of us came down to work with these CEOs, not government officials from Switzerland and Germany, but CEOs showing why it made so much sense to invest in these apprenticeship models. It had incentives to break through the timing issue, and I think we didn't take it up. It's grabbing in some places. Some of the social innovation stuff in apprenticeships is amazing, but it's not at scale yet. And I think both of those things speak back to timing and risk. If I can, I want to talk about a couple of startup things, because at Impact Principles, we've been working with businesses that are trying to do better for the public good, and we're working with public benefit organizations that are trying to survive financially as a business. To meet in the middle there, we're doing work with Innovation Works, with many of you have done, and that is really an organization that is trying to work with people in reality, the AMAs that have real problems right after this meeting, to keep their organizations going and serve people. So that's sort of a place that if you want to, you want to look to invest in, who's investing in social entrepreneurs, there's Upsurge Baltimore that we're starting to work with around the movement of Equitech and how to get people energized over audacious ideas. But on the small scale, I'm on the board of the Biotech Institute of Maryland. This is like a little hidden gem in our city that every year 50 people get turned into bench scientists that just have a high school degree, get placed in as lab techs, and it's working. Now it's hard work, but if we could get these organizations to scale, that's the trick, is get them to be able to scale and not be one-offs or just barely surviving in that constant mode. And then the last thing I'll speak about is one of my startups. I have a startup right now called Circonomy, which is about decentralization. It's about keeping value in a community that generates that value. Often very hard to do. So this is using decentralized Web3 tools that break through the timing issue, that allow communities to benefit because it's baked into the code. It's not waiting for somebody to vote on it or be gracious enough to make them a donation, that kind of thing. And that's based on some real economics that I think the last thing I would say about being optimistic is economics is bringing us to a real moment here. If you look at the last few cycles of Nobel Prize winners in economics, Doug North won in the 1990s when he said, hey, it's better for our economy if we adapt than if we're just efficient. We move money cleanly is not as valuable as if we can adapt. That means we need to experiment. Adaptation doesn't happen unless you try things that are experimental. The next person, 2009, Elinor Ostrom won the economic Nobel Prize around circular economy, and she showed that we can break through the tragedy of the commons, which is really important, that groups can manage the shared public good without just take, right? And she's baked that into economics, and there's many people now trying to apply that. I think there's real hope there. And then last year, this is fascinating for anybody who has ever tried to look back at the data, like our foundation partners, and say, well, what really worked? What should I do going forward? Josh Angrist and another who's from MIT and Oberlin found a way to look back at data. Particularly in his case, he was looking at premature babies, what treatments actually helped them survive. He found a way to extract data that didn't matter and then look forward about where we should put our money. What this breaks through is the need to do this random controlled experiment. We could look backwards and see what works and then apply it going forward. So I say this because I think economics has always been sort of this I'm not an economist or a trained academic person, but it's always been sort of a theoretical thing. Well, where the world is right now, and where these social entrepreneurs have been trying to work, the economists are catching up that it shows that this works. Harvard Business School, George Serafin shows that companies that do good with ESG do better on their bottom line, and that's because their customers and their employees want it. So I think the big thing from my perspective of being inside the government and then working with these startups is our solutions all need to sort of address reality, the market, like what's really going to work in the market, and then the timing and the risk issues that the public side just can't take up. So I think that's it for mine, and I'll jump into questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Will. I think we've had a rather extraordinary 360 on terms of representation of sectors, insights, and now the question would be, what is it that people would like to know? We have one question that, let's see, I get to the Q&A, that concerns probably the overview, and that with Jim, are these initiatives that you're talking about, and it could be for anyone else, are they backed by state and federal legislation? What legislation actually facilitated or forms barriers for these types of activities?
You know, one of the bizarre things about where we live is you've got, state versus federal versus local regulation. So without punting too much, the answer kind of depends on where you sit. But a lot of this happens, quite frankly, in the private investment market. So, there's not as much financial enabling. And one of the things I really liked about what Will had to say was this whole notion of taxpayers and risk aversion, which is absolutely true. I don't want to mess with my tax dollars either. But one of the things that's interesting in the social impact bond construct is the government doesn't assume any upfront risk. So let me see if I can make this little magic trick work. I mentioned this resource in my remarks, and this is one of the projects. I mentioned these projects that are happening around the country, and this happens to be recidivism, which was my example, but that's quite frankly just good fortune. But you see, as you get down here, that the upfront investors are all philanthropic. And then here it says outcomes funder is the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And what you get down to here is you say, okay, so the value of payments for the reduction of days in incarceration is based on associated savings to the Commonwealth, but budgetary savings would equal the cost of delivering the services. So what that basically means is there's a 1-for-1 return. So you save me $1 in reducing recidivism, I pay you $1. Now, I can't imagine it's actually 1-to-1 because I don't think that would be palatable for the government. But if the program achieves target impact, then Goldman Sachs receives returns at an annual interest rate of 5%, and the junior lenders get 2.5% annual interest rate, and so on and so forth. So the government only is involved in these transactions on the back end when the savings are actually produced. So one of the nice things about that from a legislative standpoint is it reduces the risk. So that's sort of my thoughts on that. But as far as legislative, it's all over the map in terms of who is what. And I'm sure some of my colleagues have got insights that I don't have in that regard.
What I would say about the example of a barrier for legislative barrier for higher ed is that, right, there's been a systemic disinvestment in public higher ed over a long period of time, right? And an example, how it impacts our scholars, for example, is that those who are eligible in the state of Maryland for public support, public financial aid, there's 2 programs that we focus on. One in particular, for example, is the Educational Assistance Grant. The EA grant was intended to cover 40% of the cost of education, which is tuition plus room and board, okay? 40%. Well, the amount that they give right now is $3,000. It's been $3,000 since 1996. There has been, and we know, right, the diminished value of $3,000, what it can, because at the same time, right, the cost of tuition has skyrocketed. So today, the average cost of public higher ed in across the state, across all public colleges, about $24,515. 40% of that is $9,800. Okay, but I just told you we're giving $3,000 for aid. So that's just an example of it's not caught up. And we also know from doing research that the state of Maryland is one of 5 top wealthiest states in the country, but ranks 30th when it comes to investing in public higher education. So that's just an example of, right, huge missed opportunity and a lack of disinvestment over the years.
Thank you. Will, I think you were going to also comment. Thank you, Emma.
Well, I wanted to push back on Jim a little bit. And that was because Jim, you and I have talked.
That's why we invited you, my friend.
We've talked in the past about, hey, why haven't social impact bonds taken off? Why is paper for performance happening in Europe for 25 years and not here? And I know you pointed out some attempts at them early, 10, 20 years ago here in Maryland that I haven't seen they make so much sense if you can de-risk it and solve the timing issue and society improves and the investor gets their return. But why aren't they happening? Like you just showed us why they should happen, but why aren't they're not happening for some practical reasons. One of the things I think may be happening, and I was happy to see Dean Hartley just told me he and Eleanor Ostrom at Indiana were colleagues. He learned under her about circular.
I'm a huge fan. I'm jealous, Roger.
We don't have a price built in on natural resources and pollution and downstream costs, right? We just don't have it. We have a lot of our balance sheets are not true balance sheets about what things cost. I think as that comes on, this is kind of about your civic wealth idea. As that comes on, as we get to the true prices of implications to public health or climate or plastics in the ocean, and when those numbers show up and that can arrive in the price of a company or a product. Now you have a moment where social entrepreneurs can really thrive because the numbers will work. I feel like that may be the thing that changes it from social impact bond potential that you're talking about to social impact bond. Why isn't this happening all over the place? I think it's a price issue.
Yeah, no, I agree. And a lot of it is subsidized. And as you saw in the example that I put up a minute ago, the junior investment partners are getting a 2% return. Now in today's market, 2% isn't great, but it's not awful either. But there's this whole notion you hear in these circles of a concessionary return, which I just find to be a bizarre phrase on a lot of fronts. But you do see that in places. Interestingly enough, there's another one that I was going to pull up and I didn't, which is a wastewater social impact bond in DC that actually has some of that in there. So they're playing with it. But I agree with you 100%. I also think that quite frankly, the American economy, the American economic perspective is so oriented to go, build, that it's a little harder in this country to pull some of these off than it is other places, but darn, it makes sense.
Thank you, Jim. If I could have a facilitator's prerogative for a moment, and maybe this is an editorial comment, but from the perch that I have from having been in healthcare administration for 15 years, a consultant for a brief period and more international work in the last several decades, it seems to me that there is too often for the matters that we're discussing, some conflation of what is a cost and what is an investment. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity that remains on that. I would like at this point to bring a question to Darius, and it relates to a different aspect of market than what Will was talking about. With foundations, the performance of their investments in the marketplace sometimes influence what they can do in a particular period and what they must do in terms of distribution of earnings and monies. And I don't know if you can give us perspective from the Weinberg Foundation or from generally the philanthropic perspective. Is the down market currently causing more stringent focus on limited priorities or just less for everyone? Or is this not an issue now?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it reminds me, I should have included earlier the phrase that our team often use, which is if you know one foundation, you know just one foundation, because we are all have our different ways of doing things and different protocols and processes. So the one thing I will just say up front is that for our foundation, for Weinberg, there are two different teams, two separate teams that handle these separate kinds of investments in air quotes. So I would say investments in air quotes when I'm saying grants, which are not investments for financial return, but just sort of investing for a social return. These are grants that never have to be paid back. These are two nonprofits. And so that's what the team that I'm on does. We have a separate investment team that manages the foundation's endowment and invests for financial return. There may be, in some cases, some social considerations in how they do investments, but it is managing the endowment for growth in perpetuity. And so I think in both cases, we will take for the team that's making the grants, we essentially get what our distribution is for the year. And based on that and the individual requests we get, we would make our recommendations for grants. But the investment team is the one that really has to deal with the challenges in the market and sort of how those investments are going to be made. I think, when there are times of economic pressure, whether it's because of the pandemic or recession or any other things, I think one of the things that we try to do on the grant side is to be a little more flexible and proactive with our grantees. When COVID initially arrived, we did a lot of emergency grants where we told our organizations, you don't even have to apply to us. Like, we've given you a grant before. We know you're doing this great work. We know like things are wild right now. So let's just give you a grant to help you get through these first initial months until we figure out what's going on. And so we try to be flexible during those times, but of course it's limited based on what our budget is and other priorities.
That last part was fascinating because it's something I bring up frequently at the university when we look at academic productivity or other metrics. And I preface it by saying, let's specify the context. We're in an unprecedented era, and this is what people are functioning in. We can't pretend that it didn't happen. So what I would like to throw out, since we have both Dean Hartley and our keynote and all of our speakers still on the call, and we're coming from an educational institution, as we consider these matters around sustainable financing, from a CEO leadership perspective, what Amma was discussing, what are the skill sets that are required for the people who would be the social entrepreneurs? And are there enough people with those skill sets to do the things that we've heard, Will from you and Amma from you and Darius from you? What are your insights regarding that?
Thanks, Alan. I could jump in, and I would love to hear the other panelists talk about this a little bit as well in terms of skill sets. But, I see it kind of referring to some of what I said at the very beginning of the webinar as a real need for someone who can function, communicate, lead across many, many different sectors. I mean, a social entrepreneur needs to be able to interact effectively with government leaders and understand the public sector very, very well, but also be able to interact with business leaders and other civic organizations as well as nonprofits. It means a very broad education. But then more importantly, too, I wanted to add in some of those frameworks I discussed. An understanding of responsiveness and an understanding of social equity is critical for any social entrepreneur to be able to really understand need and understand where those in need are coming from, and also not just from the standpoint of need, the perspectives and power and strength that they bring to their neighborhoods, to the policy discussion itself, that rich knowledge that gets missing from our typical discussions in public policy that have them absent at times. So I think that's really critical. I guess any professor would say, or retiring professor who's now a dean would say, excellent communication skills, excellent writing skills, excellent ability to interact with people of different types and from different backgrounds is really, really important. We have a degree here at the University of Baltimore that's a master's degree in nonprofit management and social entrepreneurship, which tries to bridge the boundaries of both the Merrick School of Business as well as the College of Public Affairs. And so it's a joint degree in this particular case. So I also think for universities, there needs to be, and we always talk about this, but it's easier said than done, believe me, but we always talk about the need for more interdisciplinary programs, noting what I just said a minute ago, the ability for a student to understand so many rich areas of the policy environment and the work environment really entails being able to not just study one thing from one trick. I guess those are my
Roger,
thoughts.
I could observe that our speakers today represent someone with an MBA, DPA, someone with a master's degree, someone with double mastered, and someone with a Juris Doctor degree. And I think what I'm asking is, are academic preparations alone sufficient for the kinds of roles that we need? And again, I'll throw it back to our speakers, and thank you for your insights, Roger.
Sure.
So, Alan, I'm going to take your second question that you originally asked first, which is, are there enough? And in my opinion, is flatly no, there aren't. But one of the things, it's interesting, and I sit in the academy now. I haven't sat there all my life, but I do now. And the academy loves the phrase interdisciplinary. And I would submit to you that social entrepreneurship is actually extra disciplinary. And that, in my opinion, you've got business, you've got nonprofit management, you've got social work, you've got community engagement, you've got a whole bunch of different things. But when you put them together and they are done well, and there's lots of great examples of them done well, not just on this call, but in Baltimore, you get something that isn't just the sum of its parts. The analogy I often use is the difference between cooking and baking. Baking, you take a very precise formula and you produce a very predictable result, but it's something new, right? Mm-hmm. Cooking, you combine a bunch of flavors, but baking, you take yeast and water and you have bread, which is an entirely new substance. So, it's a very different thing, in my opinion, that I think extra disciplinary. And I like to think that that's where the field is going, and programs like Dean Hartley's, programs like the one I run at UMB. There's a couple of other institutions in town that have similar sorts of things. You're starting to see that blend between disciplines and moving it forward, which I'm happy about. So I have hope for the future, but I do think there's not enough of it now.
Thank you.
What I would add to what's been said is that I think, I used to be an adjunct instructor at Baruch in School of Public Affairs, and I taught for 4 years master's students in public administration. I sit currently on the advisory board at Syracuse Maxwell School. I'm also a graduate. So obviously I value education. And I think having a strong analytical foundation is super important, whatever your major is, right? If you're an English major, you need to know how to write in a compelling way, not just a book report, right? You're not summarizing. And being able to make a case statement is essential as a leader, because you're trying to convince others to invest in you, to be your partner, to be, a strategic a partner with you. And that's huge. I'm sure Darius could tell you, having seen some, very poorly written proposals, what a difference, Head and Shoulders makes. Even if you're providing great results, if you're not able to communicate well, right, you're not able to bring in partners. But what I would also say, which I think is often missing, is a real strong sense of cultural competency and the ability to connect not just with people who are racially and ethnically different from you, but also ideologically. Being able to draw in people who may not even be supporters, right? How do you attract somebody who is maybe on the face of it doesn't support you, but then maybe they don't fully understand what it is that you're after? And so how do you as a leader, how can you exert influence, even though maybe you disagree on some things? What are some of the shared values that you have? And then those are the things that you can build on. That is an enormous skill, to be able to influence people who are of different, ideological persuasions than you, especially I would say now more than ever. And I just can't say enough about this analytical capability. I mean, you really need to be able to, because resources are limited, be flexible enough to know who to bring in, why, how, and really stay focused on what your mission is. I think sometimes you can have an opportunity to get off track because you're pursuing resources or support or partnership. But if it's not in alignment with where you really need to be going, because that's what your mission is, then you could really waste the other limited resources sort of chasing dollars or chasing other things that are not aligned with your North Star. And I think having the analytical capability to be able to understand that is important. And I would also say to be able to say no, right? Strategically say no to things. Sometimes you get opportunities that sort of are emerging that maybe weren't on your radar. But if you have your strategy in place, if you have your North Star, if you know your resources and how your team, you have to be able to know your team and how far you can stretch them and how far you can't, and be able to say no. And sometimes it's well-intentioned, right? It could come from your board. It could come from external partners in the community that think that you might be able to do it. But if based on whatever your constellation of factors are, you're not able to do it, you're better off strategically saying no than saying yes and doing poorly. So I would add that to the mix.
Excellent.
And the only other thing that I would add is just like, yes, I think you have to have it all and do it all. And I think that's why in my work with Social Innovation Lab, when I led that program, we would encourage people to work together in teams because, I may not have the technical expertise to create an app, but I know how to work with people and build relationships and help us get it out there, while someone else may have the technical expertise. The other thing that I would just add on to is just the lived experience, again, that we talked about, so that having the experience of dealing with the issue that you're trying to address, that's something that, generally, cannot necessarily be taught, but gives you just such a different approach to the work that you're doing. Me, for example, when I'm working with these nonprofits, I have sat in their seat where I have gone to foundations to request funding and had positive and not positive experiences. So that shapes how I approach them in the work that I do. And that's something that, I wasn't taught in law school or any other school, but it's just really an important part of the work that I do.
I think these are all critical points in terms of the lived experience, the realities of the market that you brought, Will, and with Amma, the importance of numeracy. One of the things that I observed over multiple decades now is that no one seems proud of being illiterate. That's something that there won't be an active declaration, yet even people I know who have doctoral degrees will humorously say, well, I was just never very good with numbers. And I'm thinking, you can't be a fully functioning citizen without this ability. You have marginalized yourself. And yet that seems to be where we are. So I think some of the foundational aspects of how social change and meeting the needs of society and capturing some of the value starts to be even more important now than ever. There is a researcher, an economist at University College London. Her name is Mariana Mazzucato. Her book is The Entrepreneurial State. And Jim, I know you're familiar with her work. This makes the argument quite clear that what has happened too often is that we have privatized gains and we've socialized costs. And I think if I were to put a footnote on what I have heard so far today with this keynote and panel that is just stellar. I'm so proud of what we have created here today. I would say that still is occurring, and her work and your work is where we need to keep bringing awareness of opportunities and pushing. I see no further questions. So if you have comments or questions for each other, now would be the time. Otherwise, I've understood in this life, I'm 72 now, that the best thing you can do for someone is give their time back to them.
I do have one question, and it's partly for Darius, but it's kind of for everybody. So, I mentioned early on about my sort of concept about 501c3 as a tax status, not an operating model, even though it's become shorthand for an industry. And one of the things that I'm a huge fan of is the notion of fiscal sponsorship, where a startup organization can basically rent 501c status from a larger organization. And my experience has been that can be a huge help in getting you through those early sort of bumpy stages. And I guess I'm curious for anybody's thoughts about whether or not that can also become a larger tool later down the road. So you've got all these various parties in this crazy social impact bond thing that I think is so brilliant that we're struggling to make happen in this country. And I'm wondering, I guess maybe the larger question is, what is the role of intermediaries in this? And is perhaps one of those intermediaries someone who can operationally bridge the for-profit and the nonprofit through something like a fiscal sponsor? So that's a rambling question, but I think my friends are hip to where I'm going here.
Yeah, and it's that the fiscal sponsors, the intermediaries, are a really important part of this ecosystem. I think one of the things that we always advise, grantees of ours or just applicants who are looking for a fiscal sponsor, like there may be different options out there, and you can use their 501c3 tax status. They will do some of your accounting and back office work. But, we always tell them that doesn't mean that you don't have to do that. You don't have to pay attention to that. You can't just hand over the business operations essentially to another organization. You need to understand what's happening. And so I think the fiscal sponsors can help as an entity because they can get you started up really quickly. They can help you focus more on the programming than the paperwork, but it's not a substitute for your, understanding how that paperwork happens and the implications that it has for your organization.
I used to work at a financial intermediary that's national, but in the New York City program called LISC. And there's one I don't know if there's one in Baltimore, but Enterprise Foundation is in Baltimore. Mm-hmm. And I think an additional value is that we also provided technical assistance. So it helps, grow the entity, provide it with, support around infrastructure and how it can make itself sustainable, not just be a fiscal conduit, but also how to grow an organization. So I think it is a powerful tool to use.
I think I would add to that as well that I think we're talking about backstops and safety nets so that people actually have a chance to get on the playing field and not just burn out, be out of money, but giving them a chance, give them a platform to start. Either they make it or they don't, but they shouldn't not make it because they couldn't start. And I think that's where you were going, Jim. And Darius, I know I was part of organizations that would come to funders. We would try to collaborate because the funders want that. It's so hard to do because you're just trying to survive. The thing I would keep an eye on, the thing I'm deeply involved in, is all types of investors are interested in this right now, particularly in the decentralized space. I'll give the example of Circonomy. We started in a fellowship that was free. We've moved on to the Cello Foundation Accelerator, which kicks out tens of thousands of dollars while it's giving you help to Emma's technical support, to her point, but it's giving you some money to actually stay afloat. The next one we're considering is A16Z that gives you $500,000 to join their accelerator. Now, and they're going to take 7% of your enterprise. That is a sea change coming, that they're addressing both things, that you need a little bit of money to actually have a platform, or you need a fiscal sponsor, but you need help too at the same time. You can't have one or the other. And I think decentralization is going to just upend a lot of these models that we haven't been able to connect the dots across these different silos.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm jumping around a bit, but I want to pick up on another point that Jim mentioned, which is around the nonprofit being a tax status versus I forget the term, I think, but not as a business model necessarily, because
An operating model, yeah.
yes, because you do want to have a profit. It's just the profit doesn't go to you. It sticks with the organization in a sense. And one of my many dreams is that nonprofits and their leadership get recognized as savvy and capable and important to our economy as business owners and business leaders, because you are in fact running a business enterprise, and you are changing really challenging social issues, and often doing with fewer resources than other types of entities. So I think, yes, you have to have that ability to run your enterprise so that you're meeting your budget requirements, and so that you're actually changing people's lives at the same time. So that's one of my dreams for our world.
And thank you, Darius, for that. And I couldn't agree more. And that's one of the reasons why I bang my shoe on the table so much about this point about you're actually producing economic value. And I think the problem, and again, particularly in an American context, is that it's not seen that way. Mm-hmm. And quite frankly, I lay a lot of that fault on the sector and on us as people who are leading that sector to, again, it's that folks don't understand how to quantify that, and then how to stand up and say, gosh darn it, I did this. You're going to pay me for it.
Well, I would add that even if you say I did this and you're going to pay me for it, the public doesn't understand why. Why? Here's an example. We get very little public support, shockingly. Most of our funds come from individuals or foundations, very little from corporations and very little from government. But we were applying for federal support, and the local county has a basically civilian review committee that you have to present in front of and share. And I have done it maybe the last 4 years or so. And the questions that are asked, you can tell that there is not for the general public, because they're not trained in, right? They're just volunteers who happen to be serving on these committees. I don't know if they're not getting training or instruction, but there's very little understanding about what it takes to get this work done. And I think partially there's this, if you work in the nonprofit sector, you're sort of a step away from being a volunteer. And then people don't think that you are a skilled executive, a skilled professional, and therefore should be compensated. So I spent a fair amount of time educating general public about what it is we do, why it's important, what happens, right? The alternative, what happens if we're not doing this to our constituents. So it is an uphill battle because there's a real lack of understanding about what it takes to function like a business.
It's one of the reasons why I avoid the term whenever possible.
Roger?
This discussion made me think of something else, but related here is, and I'll start it with a question and I'll try to answer it, but I'm really interested in your answers. But is there a vulnerability to some social entrepreneurs, young and old, a vulnerability in knowledge of legal processes, vulnerability in knowledge of the business world and the nonprofit world? And could that vulnerability lead, without support, without an intermediary, as you had mentioned, Darius, an opportunity for people to be taken for granted, for products to be moved in directions away from social entrepreneurships and their intent? I would even say with that vulnerability or that lack of an intermediary, even ethical concerns come into play as well. And I'm thinking here of students that I've run into in the past that were young, really excited, had really great ideas, and wanted to right out of school start their own nonprofit and or their own social entrepreneurship. And who is taking them under their wing? Their integrity, I think, matters deeply. And so you had me wondering about that with the initial question, but as the flow of the conversation went, I started thinking a little more deeply about how does that protection exist, and how do we afford individuals, young or old, an opportunity to succeed, but not get gobbled up, perhaps.
I think they're hugely vulnerable. And I think one of the places where the sector, the industry, the segment, whatever term you want to use, has yet to mature is that it is still very often led from the heart. And that doesn't mean that the heart is at all unimportant. It is certainly the most important thing. But, as my Presbyterian pastor likes to say, you have to have the heart and the head, in sort of equal tension. And I think that's a place where a lot of folks miss that. Whereas if they want to, if they want to launch a business, they're like, oh yeah, I'm going to make $1 billion, which is also the wrong reason to become a commercial entrepreneur. But yeah, this dividing line that we built culturally. I mean, I'm hit the nail on the head. We've built this dividing line where we think, you're either profit or purpose. And, to some of Will's points, it is starting to collapse. And I think some of that is generational as well. But yeah, there's huge benefit for folks across the spectrum to be vulnerable in this, and not to feather my own nest or to feather your nest, Dean, is that's the role of education, right?
Thank you. If I could share my screen for a moment, Jared.
Yeah, you're good. You can do whatever.
Okay. So let's see. I know what I want to show. It's on my desktop now. Can I do that?
If you click share screen in the middle, it should just be desktop 1.
Okay. So this, in a way, connects with the last couple of comments. As a faculty member, in general, the sense is you're a teacher, you should do anything that we need, and you should be able to do it for free. And you have flexible hours, so it should be evenings, weekends, and other times. So selectively, surprisingly, a number of faculty say, sure, the psychic income is there. And Dr. Pearson and myself were faculty members in Dean Hartley's college. And so for about 4 years, we did volunteer. We were teachers in the dojo in Hamden, in Maryland, in Baltimore. And it's a lower socioeconomic area. It was at the Roosevelt Center. And it was really quite minimal financial requirements. And I came to learn what an uphill battle it is just to keep something as tightly focused as this instruction is for the very young, so that we have an alternative to being on the streets. You can get recognition and you can learn self-management and life skills while you're learning some self-defense. And it might displace some of the attraction of other things that we're competing.
So was that class today?
I'm sorry?
Oh,
Okay. So
we want to sign up, Alan.
well, here's the thing. For reasons that are a case study, we did this for about 4 years. I said my strengths are with the older community, so I focused on older residents in areas where many of the social options were not particularly directly relevant to people who were mature. So these possibilities exist, but I just want to talk from not the head, as you say, Jim, but from the heart, that what I saw were souls confronting a society that was either extremely difficult to make progress in, or that was indifferent. And the types of work that we have discussed here today, I think, is supremely important. I think it has been a stellar group that we brought together. This is rich information that we'll have in the recorded session that we can make available for others. I wanted to bring this up because it's something that you don't mention your volunteer work, but I wanted to point it out, first of all, because Dr. Pearson's there also, so it's not just me, but to say that there are some lessons that can only be born of experience. And I learned more from that than I did from the classroom. And I will, Will?
Yeah, I always say, I'm looking at that picture and that's 2014. I think you were just a little ahead of your time there. The receptivity in our society for this work is here. We have existential moments socially with Black Lives Matter, with climate, with all kinds of crises. People are open. Maybe give this another shot now that you guys were a little bit early, but I think it's coming. And I know people have been trying things for a long time that didn't work, but it's optimistic to see what you guys were doing even back then.
Well, I must give credit to where it is due. I met someone in 2000 at the University of Baltimore. He was a business graduate and an entrepreneur who lived in Hamden. He also had a black belt in Muay Thai. So he started the school, John Starling, and we were having a conversation after he had started it. And I said, my skills are getting rusty. We were having lunch. He said, I've got just the opportunity for you. And he closed the deal right then. And so then I talked to Bridal and I explained it and he said, sounds great. So it really wasn't a difficult sell. And I think you're right, Will, time and place. Unfortunately, John has been living now back in South Korea for maybe 5 years, 6 years. But an example to round out the other examples that we have. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And unless there are some other questions, I would want to give you time in your life back. Very few people can do this. Okay, thank you so much, Dean Hartley, Amma Felix, because I know you are fitting this in with the National Academy of Public Administration's annual meeting. She is a fellow. Darius, thank you so much. I know you have a very busy schedule and I appreciate this. Will, a man of accomplishment. I appreciate also the perspective you've brought. And what I'm hopeful is that an outcome, in addition to what we've talked about, is that now you all, I'm from North Carolina, so I'm not going to say y'all, but you all know each other. And I think that's a positive outcome because of the values and the intentions that you have with your careers. If there's anything that I can do, reciprocity theory, I would be delighted to reciprocate. So let me know, okay?
Thank you, Alan.
Thank
you.
you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Ciao. Bye-bye.